and see what happens. The thing, actually, the question I think one links from the other is that they ask me, you have a reputation as a quiet but forceful negotiator who listens, and then they ask a question about negotiation in terms of that approach style, and then what did you sort of learn in the labor? Is it the Department?
And why don't you start out with the first one about the labor negotiations?
Okay, fair enough. Are you ready now?
Why don't we just have a little talk, a little chat, so that I can...
Sure. How was lunch for...
Well, it was filling.
What'd you
On
have?
a hot day. I had salmon. So that's light enough. And I didn't have any dessert, and I didn't have any wine, because I wanted to be alert for this interview.
Great. Did
Okay.
you get enough level? Thanks, Dan. And so we're speeding along. Mr. Shultz, so what aspects of your experience in labor relations helped you in various international negotiations conducted as a Secretary of State?
Well, I think there are all sorts of relationships between what you learn in the labor negotiation area and what you learn in lots of other areas. And one of the things that Bob McKersie has done is to really dramatize that point and help people in their understanding of it so that they can transport one kind of learning to another. I'll give an example. In the field of labor relations, right after World War II, there were a tremendous number of strikes, and they were written about what causes all these strikes. And some people had the idea that there were a lot of relationships where things were going relatively well. So a series of studies were commissioned, and I did a couple of them, on the causes of industrial peace in labor relations. But among the things that I and others observed when we were doing that was that you'd have these good relationships and they would deteriorate. And so you'd ask yourself, what caused a relationship to deteriorate? And the answer seemed to be that people started prizing the relationship too much. And so if a guy on the shop floor had a grievance, his shop steward told him, forget it, you'll upset the apple cart. If a foreman was struggling to get something done and getting people aggravated, the same sort of thing would happen. So pretty soon, the relationship is not serving the interests of the people who are part of it, and it would tend to blow up. Now, when I was Secretary of State, our so-called relationship with China was rocky. And every time something would happen, the Chinese would say, don't do this or don't do that, or if you do this, it will cause the relationship to deteriorate. And Ronald Reagan was a union leader in his younger days. He was head of the Screen Actors Guild. And he enjoyed talking about his negotiating experiences. And he and I hit it off that way. And I remember saying to him before my first trip to China in early 1983, which turned out to be kind of a turnaround, I said, you know, I learned this from my labor relations experience, and I think the same thing is true here. And we should say to the Chinese that our relationship is not something we strive for in the abstract. It's something that will result from our ability to solve problems and take advantage of opportunities. And if we're effective at doing that, the relationship will be a good one. And if we're not, it won't be. So we're not going to pay for the relationship in our bargaining. It's going to have to be an outcome.
You have a reputation as a quiet but forceful negotiator. How did this style serve you in negotiations, and when did you occasionally have to opt for a different approach?
Well, sometimes you have to raise your voice a little bit for emphasis, but I think if you listen and you're quiet but forceful, you're more likely to be effective. Negotiation is in part a process of learning about what the really important things are on the other side. And it's not only what you learn by the interaction across the table, what you learn in other ways. But you're trying to figure out, of these 10 items, these 3 are central to the other side, and there's some other ones that aren't so central. So if you can scale them that way, maybe there's a way to scale your own objectives and see where you can interact to some degree. So I think listening is pretty important, but they've got to see at the same time that there is something that has a bottom line to it. I remember, to once again go to the international realm, when I was first dealing with China, they had a foreign minister who was a very fierce guy. His name was Huang Hua. And in our first meeting, he took off on me about Taiwan and our support for Taiwan. And he said, how would you like it if we picked out one of your states in your country and we started whipping them up and supplying them with arms and so on, and I bet you would resent it. And he went on for about 15 minutes like this, and I looked at him and I said, just keep your cotton-picking hands off California. And he laughed. So sometimes a little back and forth like that. But I think there are some big things that are important across the board in negotiations. The 2 people sitting across the table from each other represent the tip of the iceberg. There's always a lot of publicity about the people who are doing the bargaining, but no one should deceive themselves that that's really where the essence is. The essence is in building strength and building credibility. If it's well known that you're a union that will never strike, or you're a management that will never take a strike, then you've deprived yourself of the essential strength that will be needed. Once again, in the case of our dealings in the Reagan administration with the Soviet Union, we were able to be effective with them after they saw our strength, after they saw that we could help to create a cohesive NATO alliance that would deploy nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles in Germany. In spite of all the hullabaloo, they didn't like that, but they had to say, all right, we've got to deal with these people. And by the same token, many other aspects of the military strength that went with the Reagan administration. So that strength meant that we were dealing from it, but also they had to deal with it, and it drew them to the bargaining table. Then I think that in a negotiation, you're constantly asking yourself about the guy that is across the table from you. Does he represent his constituency? And you know very well, you know in your own case, that you can't get very far separated from your own constituency and get affected by your dialogue across the bargaining table and wind up doing things that your constituency won't support, because then you have a hard time. So I've always felt that the toughest bargaining going on in a negotiation, whether it's a labor negotiation or an international negotiation, whatever it is the bargaining that goes on within the constituencies of each side. And if you see that the person you're dealing with isn't connected, you know that that's not a good person to deal with. And you're also looking at personal relationships. I remember once the Soviet Union had Gorbachev come into power, and shortly after he came into power, he appointed a man named Shevardnadze as his foreign minister. And Shevardnadze had been the head man in Georgia, had no particular experience in foreign affairs, but he was experienced in the affairs of the Soviet Union, and we were, of course, all speculating what kind of relationship does he have with Gorbachev. When we deal with him, is he on good terms with his boss? So one of the first things that Gorbachev did when he came into office was put a ban, practically a ban on vodka. Thought the Russians drank too much vodka. So he made it very hard to get vodka. Not impossible, but hard to get vodka. And any state occasion when you went to Moscow in those days, the caviar was there, but no vodka. You had wine. It was terrible. But anyway, that's the way it was. So we had the first meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan. It was in Geneva. And in the protocol of these events, it went back and forth. And the first dinner was given by Gorbachev for the U.S. delegation. So there were about 6 on each side were there. And we sit around this table. And the guy comes around with a giant bowl of caviar, and you take caviar. Then he comes around and he poured vodka into the shot glasses that were around the table. And Shevardnadze picks his glass up. He gets President Reagan's attention, and he said, "Mr. President, I had to come all the way to Geneva to get vodka." And he downed it. And everybody laughed, including Gorbachev, and we said, Shevardnadze and Gorbachev are on the same wavelength. But all kinds of little things like that you're watching for in a negotiation.
Interesting. Obviously, it just as a sort of a what I mean, as a personal question, what percentage would you say of negotiations is the personal component? I mean, would you, if you had to put a percentage on it, is that?
Okay.
Yeah, would you stop tape for a second? I just was curious because so much of it is, I mean, if you have a good personal relationship, does it make negotiation more difficult? Getting back to the labor issues that you. So the question I was wondering about is what role does the personal relationship play in negotiations?
I think a personal relationship plays a role. You have to be a little careful about it because you don't want to expect, you don't want the other guy to expect that because you have a good personal relationship, you're going to make a deal that is not wise from your point of view. So sophisticated negotiators understand that. On the other hand, a decent personal relationship enables you to have a degree of trust, which is important. I'll give an example again from the dealings with the Soviet Union. When Shevardnadze, that I mentioned earlier, became the foreign minister, about a week or so after that, there was a big meeting of foreign ministers in Helsinki. It was about the Helsinki Final Act. And Shevardnadze came, and we learned that his wife was coming with him, which was unusual for the Soviet officials in those days. And my wife and I said to each other, well, here comes this new guy. Our relations with the Soviet Union are very cold. But he's a human being, and we understand people from Georgia are known as being a little more gregarious. So let's get to know them as human beings. It's not going to hurt anything. So we went out of our way to do that, and I think they must have said the same thing to each other. And we developed a certain rapport almost instantly. But then it was tested. It was tested very severely in one occasion when we made an agreement. In my case, it was well within the framework of my instructions, and I'm sure in his case too. It was a very tense subject, and we worked it out. We each had one person with us, plus interpreters, and we wound up, it was not complicated, but difficult, and we did it with a handshake, and we went back. And I had a hard time delivering on my side of the bargain, and I'm sure he did too, and we each knew it. Even though we both negotiated within the framework of our instructions, nevertheless, on something tense, people don't want to give anything up. But we both did deliver, and it created a kind of a bond that meant that we felt we could trust the other guy. So later on, one of our most difficult issues was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and in fact, more generally, the Soviet occupation of various countries. And we campaigned really to get them out. And we were having a meeting in Washington, and we had this working group approach to different subjects, and we were going to have one meeting about Afghanistan, and Shevardnadze asked to see me alone. So we went into my little back office, with interpreters and a note taker each. And he said, I just want to tell you privately that we have decided to leave Afghanistan. It's a decision. It's been made. We're going to get out. And it can be bloody on the way out or not. So we need to discuss this process. And the number of people that get killed in the process, whether it's Afghans or Soviets or what, will vary. So it's worth discussing. So I said, well, okay. And then we went back into the general room and people were reviewing the same old arguments. I looked over at him and smiled. And I went back and I told President Reagan what he had told me, because it was a big thing. And President Reagan said, well, do you trust him? Did you think that what he told you was right? I said, yeah, I don't think he would have told me that if it were not true. It turned out to be very true. And we did work the process a little bit. That probably saved a few Afghan lives, let alone Soviet lives. So that was an example of where the trust paid off.
When you think about students, what key concepts students of negotiation need to learn and really understand before they get out there in the real world of negotiations?
Well, I think some of the things that I've been talking about and many others, the importance of your inherent strength. In other words, putting the negotiation and the negotiation table into the right perspective. Your strength, your constituency, working with that constituency, the importance of doing that, judging the other person, and so on. There are all sorts of things like that, but then I think it's personal skills are important, and knowing where you're going. I remember a comment that a very gifted negotiator made to me. We were talking about somebody else, and I said he seems to have a great sense of where the wind is blowing. And my friend said, that's right, he's a great weather vane, but he needs a compass. So you need a compass, but you also need to know how the winds are blowing to make your way through. But I would say the thing to do is read a few of Bob McKersie's books. That'll tell you what you need to know.
The biggest challenges as you look at labor and management today, what do you think those are? And students are interested in addressing those specific challenges. What would you say to them as we look toward the next century?
They have to understand their environment. And I think they sort of do. They see that the units that are unionized, the people that are in the union, are working in companies or organizations that are part of a global system more and more. So the range of competition is quite large, and much of it is not within the control of the organizations involved, so they have to adapt to it. And they don't like that very much, but there it is, it's a fact. So that's one thing they have to learn. I think another that's very important is to get some measure of the gigantic demographic changes that are taking place and how they're going to affect the environment that any negotiation takes place in. That is, Japan and much of Europe are getting older very fast. It's true in the United States as well, but not as much so. But I think if you take Japan, for example, the aging population is going to have an impact on sort of the outlook of the society. And so that will represent a change, and to the extent that we have competition from Japan, it'll reflect itself there. So there are a lot of things in the environment that people need to come to grips with and try to understand. But beyond that, it's not so different.
I'll stay for a second.
Hi, Bob.
Well, let's, okay, that was,
Okay, so speed, we have speed, action.
I want to add my congratulations to you, Bob, on all you have accomplished and what lies ahead of you. You've made a major contribution to everyone's thinking about negotiations. And you've let us all see that the study of how this interesting process takes place is most worthwhile because it's so widespread. It's part of life. And I've, of course, experienced it in international as well as labor relations settings, but in many other parts of anybody's life. And you have researched it, talked about it. You do it in a very thoughtful, commonsensical way, and it's a major contribution to us. And so I want to add my thanks to those of all the other people who are contributing to this. God bless you.